I was thinking tonight about the first time I truly met myself. Funny how that happens, isn't it? You live with yourself every day, and then suddenly, in one quiet moment, you realize you've been a stranger to your own heart. I must have been 15, maybe 16. Old enough to think I knew everything, young enough to know nothing at all. There was a path through the woods behind our house, not much more than a deer trail really, narrow and winding, disappearing into shadows beneath the canopy. I'd walked past it 1,000 times but never followed it. Something about it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's story, not mine. But there was this day in early autumn when everything felt too small. The house, the town, even my own skin seemed to pinch and pull. You know that feeling. When you're growing into someone new, but you don't know who that someone is yet. I felt like a snake trying to shed its skin, but the old skin wouldn't let go. So I walked to that trail. Not with any grand purpose. I wasn't setting out to find myself or anything so dramatic. I just needed space to breathe. The path welcomed me with that particular silence that deep woods hold. Not empty silence, but full silence. The kind that makes room for your thoughts to spread out and find their shape. I walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been minutes. Time moves differently when you're alone with yourself. The trail wound deeper, and I found myself walking not just with my feet, but with my whole being. Each step felt like a conversation with something I couldn't name. And then I came to a clearing. Small, perfectly round, ringed by ancient trees whose branches created a living cathedral overhead. In the center stood a single oak, older than the others, its trunk scarred by lightning, but still strong, still reaching skyward. Beneath it, a pool of water so still it might have been a mirror. I sat by that pool and looked down at my reflection. But for the first time I didn't see what I expected. I didn't see the uncertain face I'd been carrying around, the one that changed depending on who was looking. I saw someone steady. Someone who could sit quietly with their own thoughts and not need to fill the silence with chatter or worry. I realized I'd been trying so hard to figure out who I was supposed to be that I'd never stopped to notice who I already was. I was someone who sought out quiet places. Someone who found peace in the space between words. Someone who could sit with uncertainty and not need to solve it immediately. That clearing became my place. Not a place I visited often, but a place I carried with me. Whenever life grew too loud or complicated, I could close my eyes and return to that still pool. That moment of perfect, quiet recognition. It's strange how the most important discoveries happen in the smallest moments. You think self-discovery should be dramatic, a mountaintop revelation or a moment of crisis. But sometimes it's just sitting by still water and recognizing the face looking back at you. Sometimes it's walking a path you've always seen but never taken and finding that your feet know the way. I learned that day that I wasn't meant to be loud or certain or dramatic. I was meant to be thoughtful, to seek out the quiet corners of the world and listen to what they had to say, to trust that there was wisdom in moving slowly, in taking time to truly see. That was my first real lesson in becoming myself, that becoming isn't about transformation so much as recognition. It's about learning to see clearly what was always there, waiting patiently for you to notice. The path is still there, you know. Time has softened it, made it even more subtle. But it's there for anyone who needs to find their own quiet clearing, their own still pool of recognition. Because we all have that moment waiting for us, that first meeting with ourselves when we realize we've been carrying our truest self all along. I was just thinking about Anna. Strange how certain people arrive in your life like the first warm day of spring. You don't realize how much you needed them until they're there, changing everything simply by existing. I met her during one of those difficult seasons we all pass through. I'd been carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, or at least it felt that way. You know how it is when you're young and everything seems so urgent, so impossibly heavy. I thought strength meant handling everything alone. I'd built walls so high around myself that I'd forgotten what it felt like to truly be seen by another person. Anna worked at the small bookshop on the corner, one of those places that felt like a secret, tucked between buildings that had forgotten it existed. Books stacked everywhere, cats weaving between the shelves, and always the smell of old paper and possibility. I'd started going there not for company, but for the opposite. It was quiet, anonymous. I could disappear between the shelves and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. But Anna had this way of noticing without intruding. She'd recommend a book with just a gentle touch to its spine as I passed. She'd leave a cup of tea on the table where I always sat, never making a fuss about it. Small gestures that said, "I see you and you're welcome here." One rainy afternoon, I was reading in my usual corner when I noticed her struggling with a heavy box of new arrivals. Without thinking, I stood to help. As we sorted books together, she began talking. Not the careful small talk of strangers, but real conversation. About stories that had changed her, about places she dreamed of visiting, about the way certain passages of poetry could make her feel less alone in the world. I found myself talking too. Not about the weather or work, but about things that mattered. About how I'd been feeling lost lately, like I was walking through fog with no sense of direction. About the fear that I wasn't becoming the person I was meant to be. She listened the way few people know how to listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually hearing what I was trying to say beneath the words I was managing to find. And when she spoke, it wasn't to fix me or offer easy answers. It was to share her own uncertainty, her own moments of feeling adrift. That afternoon stretched into evening, and I realized something had shifted between us. We'd moved from being strangers sharing space to being friends, sharing truth. It happened so naturally, like recognizing a melody you'd been humming your whole life without knowing where it came from. In the weeks that followed, Anna and I fell into a rhythm of understanding. We'd meet for walks when the world felt too much, or sit in comfortable silence when words weren't needed. She showed me her favorite hidden places in the city, a garden tucked behind an old church, a bench overlooking the river where you could watch the light change on the water. But more than that, she showed me what it meant to be truly known by another person. Not the careful, polished version of myself I showed the world, but the whole messy, uncertain, genuinely human version. She saw my fears and didn't try to talk me out of them. She witnessed my dreams and didn't try to make them smaller or more practical. There was this one evening. We were walking along the river as the sun was setting, painting everything gold and rose. I was telling her about a difficult decision I was facing, and I found myself saying things I hadn't even admitted to myself. She stopped walking and turned to me with this expression of complete understanding, and I realized that for the first time in my life I felt completely seen, not judged or evaluated, just recognized. "You know what you need to do," she said simply. And she was right. I did know. I'd always known. I just needed someone to sit with me in the knowing until I found the courage to trust it. Anna taught me that we aren't meant to carry everything alone, that there's a particular kind of strength that comes from allowing ourselves to be truly known by another person. Not the quick, surface knowing of acquaintances, but the deep, patient knowing of real friendship. The kind where you can share your worst fears and your brightest hopes, and somehow in the sharing, both become more manageable. Years later, when life took us to different places, I carried that gift with me. The knowledge that connection isn't about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who helps you become more fully yourself. Someone who sees all your pieces, the beautiful ones and the broken ones, and helps you understand that they all belong to the same whole. I learned that the walls I'd built to protect myself were also keeping out the very thing I needed most, the recognition that we're all walking through the same mystery together, and there's profound comfort in not having to walk alone. Anna showed me that love, whether friendship or something deeper, isn't about rescuing each other. It's about witnessing each other's journey with genuine care, offering presence instead of solutions, understanding instead of judgment. Even now, when I'm facing something difficult, I can close my eyes and remember that feeling of being completely seen and accepted. It reminds me that I don't have to have all the answers or carry every burden alone, that there's wisdom in reaching out. The bookshop is gone now, replaced by something newer and shinier. But somewhere in the world, Anna is still creating spaces where people can be genuinely themselves. Still listening with that rare gift of complete attention. Still showing others what I learned that rainy afternoon, that we become most ourselves, not in isolation, but in the warm light of true understanding. It was a winter that taught me everything I needed to know about letting go. Not the kind of winter you can see on calendars, but the kind that settles in your soul when life takes something precious away. I had a garden then, nothing grand, just a small patch behind the house where I'd spent years coaxing beauty from the earth. Roses that climbed the old fence, herbs that filled the air with their quiet fragrances, a cherry tree that blessed us with blossoms each spring like scattered prayers. That garden was my sanctuary. Every morning I'd walk among the plants with my coffee, checking on new growth, deadheading spent flowers, simply being present with all that green, growing life. It was where I went to think, to find peace, to remember that some things in this world unfold in their own time, without our worry or interference. Then came the season of endings. Not just the natural autumn that every garden knows, but something deeper. A phone call that changed everything, words that reorganized the world in an instant, the way sudden weather can transform a familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. I found myself standing in that garden on a grey morning, looking at the bare branches of the cherry tree, and for the first time I couldn't see the promise of spring hidden in those stark, empty limbs. Everything looked finished, final. The earth beneath my feet felt cold and unyielding. For weeks I avoided the garden entirely. I'd catch glimpses of it through the kitchen window, brown, dormant, apparently lifeless, and it felt like looking at my own reflection. I thought the garden was done. I thought I was done. But grief has its own seasons, doesn't it? And somewhere in the depths of that winter, I found myself walking outside again, not to tend or fix or improve anything, just to be there, to sit on the old wooden bench and let the silence hold me. That's when I began to notice things I'd never seen before. The delicate architecture of bare branches against the sky, the way frost transformed ordinary grass into something magical, the faithful green of evergreen needles quietly continuing their work of breathing and being while everything else rested. I realized the garden wasn't dead at all. It was dreaming, gathering strength in the darkness, preparing for something I couldn't yet imagine. I started visiting the garden every morning again, but differently now. Instead of checking on things, I simply sat and watched. I learned the patience of winter light, the way it arrives late and leaves early, but still manages to find its way through the clouds. I noticed how the earth itself seemed to breathe, even in its apparent stillness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to understand something about loss. That it isn't the opposite of love, it's love with nowhere to go. All that caring and tending and cherishing doesn't disappear when its object is gone. It transforms. It becomes something deeper, more patient. It learns to love the memory, the lessons, the way a life touched yours and changed you forever. Spring came eventually, as it always does, not all at once, but in tiny increments. A hint of green in the cherry tree's branches, the first brave shoots of daffodils pushing through the earth, the return of birds I'd forgotten I'd missed. But I was different now. I tended the garden with new hands, hands that had learned something about impermanence, about the preciousness of every bloom, precisely because it wouldn't last forever. I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked before. The brief perfection of morning dew, the way afternoon light transformed ordinary leaves into stained glass. The garden taught me that loss isn't something to get over, but something to grow through. Like bulbs that must spend time in darkness before they can bloom, we sometimes have to sit with emptiness before we can understand what it means to be full again. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry love in a new way. To tend the garden of memory with the same gentle care I gave to living plants. To trust that even in the darkest seasons, something essential remains alive, waiting for the right time to emerge. Then came the season of endings. Not just the natural autumn that every garden knows, but something deeper. A phone call that changed everything, words that reorganized the world in an instant, the way sudden weather can transform a familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. I found myself standing in that garden on a grey morning, looking at the bare branches of the cherry tree, and for the first time I couldn't see the promise of spring hidden in those stark, empty limbs. Everything looked finished, final. The earth beneath my feet felt cold and unyielding. For weeks I avoided the garden entirely. I'd catch glimpses of it through the kitchen window, brown, dormant, apparently lifeless, and it felt like looking at my own reflection. I thought the garden was done. I thought I was done. But grief has its own seasons, doesn't it? And somewhere in the depths of that winter, I found myself walking outside again, not to tend or fix or improve anything, just to be there, to sit on the old wooden bench and let the silence hold me. That's when I began to notice things I'd never seen before. The delicate architecture of bare branches against the sky, the way frost transformed ordinary grass into something magical, the faithful green of evergreen needles quietly continuing their work of breathing and being while everything else rested. I realized the garden wasn't dead at all. It was dreaming, gathering strength in the darkness, preparing for something I couldn't yet imagine. I started visiting the garden every morning again, but differently now. Instead of checking on things, I simply sat and watched. I learned the patience of winter light, the way it arrives late and leaves early, but still manages to find its way through the clouds. I noticed how the earth itself seemed to breathe, even in its apparent stillness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to understand something about loss. That it isn't the opposite of love, it's love with nowhere to go. All that caring and tending and cherishing doesn't disappear when its object is gone. It transforms. It becomes something deeper, more patient. It learns to love the memory, the lessons, the way a life touched yours and changed you forever. Spring came eventually, as it always does, not all at once, but in tiny increments. A hint of green in the cherry tree's branches, the first brave shoots of daffodils pushing through the earth, the return of birds I'd forgotten I'd missed. But I was different now. I tended the garden with new hands, hands that had learned something about impermanence, about the preciousness of every bloom, precisely because it wouldn't last forever. I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked before. The brief perfection of morning dew, the way afternoon light transformed ordinary leaves into stained glass. The garden taught me that loss isn't something to get over, but something to grow through. Like bulbs that must spend time in darkness before they can bloom, we sometimes have to sit with emptiness before we can understand what it means to be full again. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry love in a new way. To tend the garden of memory with the same gentle care I gave to living plants. To trust that even in the darkest seasons, something essential remains alive, waiting for the right time to emerge. Now when I walk through any garden, I see the whole story at once. The blooming and the fading, the planting and the harvesting, the seasons of abundance and the seasons of rest. I understand that beauty isn't diminished by its temporariness. It's made more precious by it. And I've learned to love winter in a way I never did before, to appreciate its quiet wisdom, its invitation to stillness, its reminder that sometimes the most important growth happens in darkness, in silence, in the patient space between what was and what will be. The cherry tree blooms every spring now, just as it always did, but I see those blossoms differently. Each petal is a small miracle of resilience, a testament to the tree's ability to create beauty even after, especially after, surviving the deep cold of winter. And I suppose that's what I learned about myself too. That the capacity for joy, for growth, for creating something beautiful with your life, it doesn't end with loss. It deepens. It becomes more intentional, more grateful, more aware of the gift that each day offers. Sleep comes easier now in all seasons. There's a peace in knowing that some things can be trusted to take care of themselves, that not everything needs to be tended or worried over, that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is simply rest and trust that morning will come, and with it, the quiet possibility of beginning again. I was thinking about how differently you see things from up high. There's a hill I used to climb when I was younger. Steep path, took effort to reach the top. I'd arrive breathless, focused only on the next step, the next stone, the strain in my legs. But tonight I'm remembering, not the climb, but the moment I finally looked up. All those paths I thought were separate, winding through the valley below, I could see how they connected. Roads that seemed to lead nowhere, actually curved gently toward each other. The river that looked so chaotic up close followed one clear, purposeful line toward the sea. From up there, I could see the whole story at once. It's like that with time, isn't it? When you're young, each day feels so urgent, so separate. This problem, that decision, this heartbreak, that joy, all scattered pieces that don't seem to fit together. But from where I sit now, by this quiet fire, I can see the pattern. How that first disappointment taught me resilience for the bigger challenges that came later. How the friend I thought I'd lost forever actually taught me something I needed to learn about forgiveness. That served me decades later with my own children. Even the mistakes, especially the mistakes, I can see now how they were. Necessary somehow, not good, not planned, but necessary. Like winter is necessary for spring, like sleep is necessary for dreams. The worry I carried for so many years about making the right choices, finding the right path, seems so unnecessary now. There wasn't one right path. They were all leading somewhere, teaching something, becoming part of the larger design I couldn't see from down in the valley. The pattern is simpler than I thought, and more beautiful. Each thread, even the dark ones, especially the dark ones, essential to the whole. From here, I can see that the journey was never about arriving somewhere. It was about becoming someone. Someone who could sit peacefully by a dying fire and trust that the path was always exactly as it needed to be. The view from here is very peaceful. Burn down to its last gentle glow, and I find myself thinking about tides,
how they come in and go out with such perfect rhythm, never hurrying, never hesitating, simply following the ancient dance they've known since the beginning of time. There was a morning, years ago now, when I stood at the edge of the ocean just as dawn was breaking. The water was calm, almost mirror-like, and I could see my whole life reflected there in that perfect stillness. Not the details, not the specific events, but the shape of it all. The way it had flowed and ebbed, risen and fallen, always moving, always changing, always somehow exactly as it was meant to be. I realized that morning that a life well lived isn't measured by its length or even by its accomplishments, but by how fully it was embraced. How completely we said yes to the experience of being human, with all its joy and sorrow, all its beauty and difficulty, all its ordinary miraculous moments. I thought about my first taste of strawberries as a child, how the sweetness seemed to contain the entire summer, the way my mother's hands looked when she was kneading bread, flour dusting her fingers like blessing, the sound of rain on the roof during those long, lazy afternoons when time seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. I remembered the weight of my newborn child in my arms, that perfect trust, that complete presence in the moment, the way my father looked the last time I saw him, how his eyes held all the love he'd never been very good at putting into words. The first kiss that made me understand why poets spend their lives trying to capture impossible feelings. All of it, the whole magnificent, messy, heartbreaking, glorious experience of being alive, rolled over me like that gentle tide. Nothing wasted, nothing lost. Everything exactly as precious as it needed to be. Even the parts that hurt, especially the parts that hurt, because they taught me how to hold the beautiful moments with